In just a few days from when I'm making this video, it will be the 344th anniversary of what has become known as the Battle of Drumclog. To briefly set the scene, these events took place in the time of the Covenanters, those who had pledged faithfulness to the National Covenant and the Presbyterian Church-style government. When Charles II came to power, even though he had previously signed the covenant and agreed to abide by it, he quickly went back on his word and began to enforce Episcopalianism so that he could better control the church in Scotland. Placing as Archbishop of St. Andrews James Sharp, a former supporter of the covenant, but now a politically motivated opponent of it. Archbishop Sharp was extremely unpopular nationally, overseeing many trials and executions of not only Covenanters, but all who seemed to support them in any way. On the 3rd of May, 1679, a group of militant Covenanters assassinated the Archbishop. The government's response was to further crack down on all conventicles, gatherings of people to hear preachers who had not accepted the changes to the Scottish Church. Often they would be preaching in open fields. One of the military leaders tasked with apprehending and even killing Covenanters was James Graham of Claverhouse, known to the Covenanters as Bloody Clavers. Years later, he would be created Viscount Dundee, and during the time of the Jacobite uprising, would become a hero to many as Bonnie Dundee. At the time, though, he was much hated and despised for his persecution of all who seemed to support the Covenanter movement. Claverhouse heard that there was going to be a large conventicle that was to be held near Darville in Ayrshire, led by the outlaw preacher Thomas Douglas, on Sunday the 1st of June, 1679. On his way, he and his troops managed to capture another outlaw preacher, the Reverend John King, and 14 others who were making their way to the gathering. The Covenanters had expected a possible raid, and so had posted a guard, who fired off a shot to warn the congregation. It is recorded that Douglas the preacher ended his sermon with these words, "You have got the theory, now for the practice." Many of the congregation then took up weapons, a few guns and swords, but mostly pitchforks and other homemade weapons, and placed themselves under the leadership of Robert Hamilton. They then set out on a march towards the area called Drumclog. Claverhouse was quite surprised to come upon an organized and armed group rather than a largely defenseless religious gathering. The armies stood facing each other across a marshy bog. As with most battles, there are different figures given for the size of each army. The Covenanters probably had about 200 to 300 men, and about 40 to 50 of them on horseback, though other accounts say that they had over 1,000 men. Claverhouse reported having only about 150 troops, all of whom had arrived on horseback. Because of the marshy ground, the government troops' horses struggled to cross the field. Claverhouse sent some of his troops forward, where they were fired upon, and one soldier was knocked wounded from his horse. The government soldiers then tried a second charge, and again were fired upon, this time with a soldier being killed. The Covenanters themselves then charged, both in the center and on the left flank. The government soldiers were completely routed, and some 30 or 40 of them were killed. Claverhouse's horse was injured, possibly being stabbed by a pike. He rode it as far as he could. Legend tells that near the village of Cowdermill, he commandeered the horse of a 14-year-old trumpeter. The legend continues that the boy was later killed and thrown down a well, now known as Trumpeter's Well, which stands in a field pictured here. Claverhouse was able to escape to Glasgow, and would continue to harass the Covenanters during the years known as the Killing Times. The Covenanters were able to free the Reverend King and the other prisoners taken earlier. Now flushed with victory, they decided to continue to march towards Glasgow. But 3 weeks later, they would be completely crushed by an army led by King Charles' illegitimate son, James, Duke of Monmouth. Though the victory at Drumclog was a small one, it was a source of encouragement to many who would be persecuted in the coming years. Ultimately, religious freedom would be restored in Scotland, and the Killing Times would indeed come to an end. Until next time, goodbye.